Stochastic terrorism. The public demonization of a person or group resulting in the incitement of a violent act, which is statistically probable but whose specifics cannot be predicted. Example: the lone wolf attack was apparently influenced by the rhetoric of stochastic terrorism. You may or may not have heard this term before. As far as I can tell, it's only been in use since around 2011, but rarely, and its origins are obscure. Around the 2015-2016 US election cycle, we saw it used again heavily for a few months, mostly by the left referring to neo-Nazis, Donald Trump, and the KKK. But then it magically just falls out of use again for some years after the election. And now recently, over the past year or so, it's made another comeback. We're going to get to some examples in a moment, but first I just want to make sure we all have a really solid understanding of what this term is and how it's going to be used. I found an article that was oddly enough published just days before the recent horrible events in the US. While the Pathos article isn't incredibly well written, it does share some valuable information about this term, and I want to walk us through understanding it. One of the main things I want you to pay attention to while I read through this article is basically how the author is trying to change the language. He's basically trying to change the definition, and a lot of people are going to find this article and go by what he says, because when I typed in stochastic terrorism, this was the first thing that came up. We're going to get into how this is a sort of postmodern linguistic tactic, and I'm going to get actually pretty deep into the postmodern strategy there. But first, I do just want to read a little bit from this article so we can get an idea of what we're dealing with. Author of the article, Luciano Gonzalez, who claims to study violence, conflict, and peace, quote, "I'm literally getting a master's degree in peace and conflict studies, despite being a former social justice intern at the American Humanist Association and apparently an aspiring screenwriter and novelist of fiction," gives the following definition for the term. Quote, "Presently the term refers to the incitement of violence targeting groups that have experienced public demonization, such as scapegoating by government officials or other significant organizations and influential individuals." Unquote. As we already know, this definition is inaccurate. It's not about the incitement of violence specifically against groups that have experienced public demonization. It's about that demonization itself, resulting in the incitement of a violent act. So if I demonize people with green eyes, for example, by saying that they're all cannibals, and then some lunatic, having heard my rhetoric, goes out and commits an act of violence against green-eyed people, I might be guilty of stochastic terrorism, even if green-eyed people have never before experienced public demonization. What's trying to be done here is obviously just the basic oppressor/oppressed narrative, where stochastic terrorism is only going to apply to people who are already demonized or already oppressed in society. That's not what this word's about. So just off the bat, that's already a huge red flag that I've seen here, but we're just getting started. Also keep in mind that this isn't a legal term. I can't actually be found criminally guilty through this definition, at least yet. What is criminal is the intentional incitement of violence. So if I were to say, for example, that green-eyed people are all cannibals and we need to eradicate them from our society, and then somebody who had heard my rhetoric commits an act of violence against a green-eyed person based on what I said, I'm guilty for inciting that violence. That's a criminal offense. Back to the article. The author then goes on to give another, this time completely false, definition of stochastic terrorism, saying that this is how he has heard leftists in his circle use the term. Quote, "It can also refer to the actual violence that people whose radicalization came not from membership in or allegiance to organized terror groups, but who owe their radicalization to a less conventional source." So this is really wrong and really strange. Just to be clear, the actual act of violence or terrorism committed under the influence of somebody else's rhetoric is still just violence or terrorism. It might be domestic terrorism, it might be a hate crime, it might just be an assault charge, but it's never stochastic terrorism. Stochastic terrorism refers to the act of inciting violence through rhetoric, and it's unclear whether or not that means intentionally or unintentionally as well, but it never refers to the actual act. That's very important to understand. Also, I don't know why he put people who owe their radicalization to a less conventional source. It doesn't matter what the source is that you owe the radicalization to. If somebody or some group or some organization is demonstrably radicalizing people, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if they're conventional or less than conventional. That's arbitrary as fuck. It doesn't make any sense that it put it there. But anyways, moving on. With this false definition, the article then goes on to describe what's referred to sometimes as lone wolf terrorism or stray dog terrorism, and we can all pretty much understand what that means. Basically, people who aren't directly connected to or members of any specific terror group, but who get radicalized through exposure to some bad ideas and then choose to commit acts of terror on their own. It may be right to connect these stray dog terrorists to the specific stochastic terrorism they were exposed to, but to call them stochastic terrorists is simply a misuse of the word. They're just terrorists. They're just domestic terrorists or whatever it is. And I fear that this way of using the word is going to be used to connect the rhetoric of certain people directly to acts of terrorism. For example, if it's revealed that the El Paso shooter was directly exposed to some obscure media outlet that talks disparagingly about immigrants, that obscure media company could be investigated for the same crimes committed by the actual terrorist. It's all just stochastic terrorism, right? And that's even if that company never specifically called for violence. It's just their rhetoric. Their rhetoric, somehow arbitrarily defined, led to this violence. They may not have even said anything untrue. They might have just been stating facts. Somebody might not like how those facts sound. Somebody might also find out the El Paso shooter was exposed to those facts through this site, and boom, you're all stochastic terrorists. I promise that's not a good way to move forward. It's just not. We're going to get into a deeper understanding of rhetoric and how this all plays into leftist politics and postmodernism, but I just want to try to stay on topic, so let's just finish with this article. The author only uses one real example of what he calls stochastic terrorism, after claiming that Fox News, Breitbart, and Alex Jones are all basically guilty of it. And of course, it's Fox's very own Tucker Carlson that he uses as an example. Quote, "When someone like Tucker Carlson says that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar hates America, you can call him out. Even if you disagree with her policies, the idea that she hates America is an idea that we should all be able to say is clearly untrue." I don't want to get carried away here on this point, but just asserting that we should all be able to say something is clearly untrue is not an argument. I'm not going to make the case for or against, but I don't think it's just obvious on its face that she doesn't hate America. I mean, that's just it's not obvious. But anyways, what I've heard from this author now in this statement is a quantifiable truth claim without any supporting argument or evidence, which I will be reporting to Media Bias Fact Check after I'm done making this video. He continues, quote, "The people who listen to Tucker Carlson uncritically and accept his rhetoric as true are potential victims of radicalization and rhetoric that states that a congresswoman hates this country, will move radicals to try and harm her. We know this to be true because fans of critics of Congresswoman Omar have in some cases already been radicalized to the extent of threatening violence against her." So first off, does this site even have an editor? I mean, this entire article is just poorly written. It's just weird. It's just not very flowy. It's very awkward. But that aside, essentially what he's saying is that anybody who accepts what Tucker Carlson has to say might then be influenced to threaten the Congresswoman, or even carry out violence, because they believe she hates America based on what Tucker Carlson said. Which is a spinning circle of fucking stupid, because not really. I mean, he said it, and they listened to what she said, and then they came to the conclusion, yeah, I think he might be right. It's not like he just said it and they just went, oh, because he said it now, I believe it and I understand it and I'm going to act on it. That's not how that works. People, unless they're sick, unless there's something wrong with them, they will typically tend to make up their own mind and not just be blindly influenced by everything somebody says. But if they agree with him, they agree with him. It's not his fault. He's stating an opinion. That's his freedom of speech. He's a news conduit. He's a, whatever you want to call him, a pundit. And he's making his opinion, and some people agree with it. The most ironic part, and the part that I find the funniest, about him picking Tucker Carlson as an example, is that he's literally had Antifa outside his home, where his wife and children live, threatening violence.
We know where you sleep at night.
We know where you sleep at night.
if you wanted to make the case for stochastic terrorism, you might look into who the hell is influencing those people to act that way, rather than a few alleged death threats to the congresswoman, which were most likely just random tweets from anonymous shitheads. I mean, oh, she got death threats. I've got death threats. I'm fucking a nobody, and I get death threats on Facebook all the time. People livid about the shit I say. I get death threats. It's the world we live in, and I'm not saying it's okay. People shouldn't send her death threats. Absolutely not. But I'm just saying, I'm not that impressed, right? I mean, you look at a video of Tucker Carlson with a gang of people outside his home, and then you look at, quote, fans of critics of Congresswoman Omar have in some cases already been radicalized to the extent of threatening violence against her. Just not that impressed with that sentence. Take from that what you will. And on top of all that, I mean, the Tucker Carlson example, you might also look into the guy who showed up trying to firebomb an ICE center in Washington state after AOC referred to the detention centers on the southern border as, quote, concentration camps. Or maybe Gavin Long, who watched and mirrored Young Turks and Sean King videos and then went and killed 3 cops. If we're playing this stochastic terrorism game with people like fucking Tucker Carlson, believe me when I say, the left is gonna lose. Every single one of their mainstream people, from Bernie Sanders to the lesbian soccer coach Kyle Kuklinski, could probably be accused of using demonizing rhetoric that theoretically could lead to some sort of violence. I mean, that's stochastic terrorism, right? It's not even about the incitement to violence, it's about rhetoric. Did your rhetoric lead to the incitement of violence? It's insane. It really is crazy. And in that case, in that same breath, it would also apply to everyone on the right too. Every social media influencer, all the journalists and news reporters, everybody with any tiny bit of influence will be at risk of being called a stochastic terrorist for having any sort of opinion about anything that matters. And the saddest part is that these are exactly the chaotic waters the postmodern left wants us to be swimming in. This is where they're comfortable. Quote, language is the center of postmodern epistemology. Moderns and postmoderns differ not only about content when arguing particular issues in philosophy, literature, and law, they also differ in the methods by which they employ language. Epistemology drives those differences. Epistemology asks 2 questions about language. What is language's connection to reality? And what is its connection to action? Epistemological questions about language are a subset of epistemological questions about consciousness in general. What is consciousness's connection to reality? And what is its connection to action? Moderns and postmoderns have radically different answers to those questions. For the modern realists, consciousness is both cognitive and functional, and those 2 traits are integrated. The primary purpose of consciousness is to be aware of reality. The complementary purpose of consciousness is to use its awareness of reality as a guide to acting in that reality. For the postmodern anti-realists, by contrast, consciousness is functional, but it's not cognitive, so its functionality has nothing to do with cognition. 2 key concepts in the postmodern lexicon, unmasking and rhetoric, illustrate the significance of the differences. To the modernist, the realist, the mask metaphor is a recognition of the fact that words are not always to be taken literally or as directly stating a fact. That people can use language elliptically, metaphorically, or to state falsehoods. That language can be textured with layers of meaning, and that it can be used to cover hypocrisies or to rationalize. Accordingly, unmasking means interpreting or investigating to get to a literal meaning or fact of the matter. The process of unmasking is cognitive, guided by objective standards, with the purpose of coming to an awareness of reality, unquote. That was a quote from Chapter 6 from the book Explaining Postmodernism by contemporary philosopher Stephen Hicks, and the entire thing is definitely worth reading, so I'll leave a link in the description. To sum it up so far, basically what's been said is that postmodernists and modernists have radically different approaches to understanding what language is and how it's used. Paraphrasing more from that chapter, he essentially goes on to describe a very complicated distinction about language made by the postmodernists, which you can pause and read now if you want. But basically, they view language as being completely disconnected from reality, as being masks all the way down, so to speak, with no point at which the unmasking takes place and any real truth can be revealed. The modernists, of course, on the other hand, believe that language essentially can be used for many things, but one of those things is to uncover truth and objective fact about reality. So that's where they differ. For the postmodernist, quote, "At any given time, a subject is a particular construction with a particular set of beliefs and interests, and the subject uses language to express and further those beliefs and interests. Language is thus functional, and this brings us to rhetoric. For the modernist, the functionality of language is complementary to its being cognitive. An individual observes reality perceptually, forms conceptual beliefs about reality on the basis of those perceptions, and then acts in reality on the basis of those perceptual and conceptual cognitive states. Some of those actions in the world are social interactions, and in some of those social interactions, language assumes a communicatory function. In communicating with each other, individuals narrate, argue, or otherwise attempt to pass their cognitive beliefs about the world. Rhetoric, then, is an aspect of language's communicatory function, referring to those methods of using language that aid in the effectiveness of cognition during linguistic communication. For the postmodernist, language cannot be cognitive because it does not connect to reality, whether to an external nature or an underlying self. Language is not about being aware of the world, or about distinguishing the true from the false, or even about argument in the traditional sense of validity, soundness, and probability. Accordingly, postmodernism recasts the nature of rhetoric. Rhetoric is persuasion in the absence of cognition, unquote. So to the modernist, language can be used rhetorically, but it can also be used as a means of expressing or uncovering true facts about reality. To the postmodernist, language is purely rhetorical all the way down. And this is why they feel no shame in using language to further their political beliefs and agendas. It's not necessary to be factually correct, because facts and language aren't even connected. To the postmodern way of thinking, it really doesn't matter if something Trump said was objectively, demonstrably a racist statement in fact. All that matters is that his rhetoric is a mask trying to cover the obvious fact that he is a racist, because they just know he's a racist. They can feel it. And this is the reason why people who seem otherwise perfectly rational can look at a tweet from Donald Trump and call it stochastic terrorism, but then see an obviously more extreme tweet from someone like Reza Aslan or Sean King and not make the connection to stochastic terrorism at all. It's almost as if they aren't even reading the exact words being said, but the feelings they interpret behind them. It's just the rhetoric that matters. The reason I'm explaining all this to you is because there's really only one way to fight and defeat this kind of behavior, and that's through the free marketplace of ideas. The intellectuals on the deep left side are very intelligent people, and they're masters at crafting rhetoric. And stochastic terrorism is coming to a favorite social media page or YouTube channel near you, I guarantee it. You just have to be armed with the knowledge about what they're doing and use their own tactics right back at them. If Donald Trump is engaged in stochastic terrorism, then let's have a goddamn stochastic party with all the insane violent rhetoric shit that leftists spew on Twitter every day. Just like the word conspiracy theorist, when they tried to pull that on the right. All it took was to show how many leftists also believe wild conspiracy theories, and that plan went straight out the window. The same thing can happen again with stochastic terrorism, and I'll leave you with a few examples to get you started.
They have no choice but to riot, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I'm not even talking about Palestinians. I'm talking about people, communities in poverty in the United States. I'm talking about Latin America. I'm talking about all over the world.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them.
Is he inciting violence?
The goal is inciting violence.
Donald Trump is trying to incite violence.
This is endangering lives.
Hateful and inflammatory rhetoric creates real danger.
This is an incitement of violence.
An incitement to violence.
But this is not just incitement to violence.
This is an incitement to violence.
Oh, I wish we were in high school. I could take him behind the gym. That's what I wish.
Of course I want to punch him in the face.
Thank you.
Yes! I'd like to punch him in the face.
This is the last time an actor assassinated a president.
When they go low, we kick them.
Her 3-year-old child.
Get your phone!
It's because they condone this behavior. This is their gang.
If you're going to shoot them, you've got to shoot to kill.
You've got to shoot to kill.
And if there's some collateral damage for some others who do not share our view, well, so be it.
Get up in the face of some Congress people.
And by the way, if I said that, they'd say, he's violent. How could he have done that?
Well, that group protests fascism. So they were there protesting fascism. Maybe their tactics weren't exactly right. All groups like that, political groups, rights groups, protest groups, it's messy. But there is a difference between the two groups. One is a Nazi, white supremacist group.
They have the nerve to politicize this. It's Trump's fault. His rhetoric made this happen. White supremacy. Shut the fuck up. Trump supporter or not, the president has nothing to do with this sick shit. Nothing. Oh, the president's racist and his rhetoric. Look, no one's rhetoric has an effect on a normal person. Trump can get on TV right now and say, everybody, you need to go out and do A. And if it's not conducive to my health or prosperity, I'm not fucking doing it.